Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the fourth week of our series, Beyond Yourself. And to kick things off, let me ask you a question. Are you a spender or a saver? Some people find a lot of safety and security in putting their money away for a rainy day, where others find great enjoyment in spending it. However, did you know there's actually a third option? In fact, in Jesus' eyes, it's even better. It's not being a spender or a saver, it's being a steward. As Nate shared, that's God's vision for your life. That's why he created you. The Apostle Paul writes about this in his letter to the Ephesians. He says that even before God made the world, he had us in mind and the good works that we would do. Now, what are those good works? A large part of it is managing the assets entrusted to us so as to ensure that every dollar is channeled to the right place. That's what it means to be a good steward. Genesis is quite clear. We were stewards before we were sinners. This is why God created us in his image and endowed us with power and authority to rule on his behalf. It was so that we would steward well all of his creation. Now, as Pastor Nate shared, did you know that there was roughly 500 verses in the Bible on faith, and there's another 500 verses on prayer, but there are over 2,000 verses on God's heart for the poor? God cares very deeply for the poor, and this is evident in the teachings of Jesus. In Luke 12, we read about this interaction. We see that someone called from the crowd, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide my father's estate with me." Jesus replies, "Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such things as that?" You see, in Judaism, the oldest son received a double portion of the family's inheritance and was responsible for dividing up the rest between all the siblings. We get the sense here that this is what they were arguing about, but Jesus refuses to get involved. Instead, he says this, he says, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." Jesus then tells a parable to illustrate the point. He says, "A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. He said to himself, 'What should I do? I don't have room for all my crops.' Then he said, 'I know, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and the other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry.'" Fun fact, that line was a saying from the Epicureans, a pagan philosophy. It would be the equivalent today of saying, retire and enjoy the good life, or have fun living the American dream. But look at what Jesus says happens next. He says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for?' Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God." Now, this sounds a bit harsh to our modern ears, so here's the backstory to that Nate provided. Most people in Jesus' day were poor tenant farmers, and only a few were wealthy landowners. The middle class was non-existent. Likewise, in Jesus' day, it was an agrarian economy in which your wealth was limited to physical commodities such as sheep and grain. Contrast that to today, in which our modern economic system has generated more wealth than any other era in human history, and where wealth has become a social construct. In other words, people nowadays can have infinite wealth because we are not paid in wheat and sheep, but in numbers in a bank account. Now, back to the parable, the wealthy landowner decides to build bigger barns rather than share his excess with the poor, and Jesus calls him a fool. Jumping down to verse 32, Jesus says this, he says, "Don't be afraid, little flock, for it gives your Father great happiness to give you the kingdom." It's interesting, we tend to assume that the motivation behind wealth accumulation is greed, but for many people, especially those who grew up in scarcity, it's actually fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of being poor like our parents, fear of a looming disaster. This brings us back to Jesus' abundance mindset. God, as our Father provider, his heart is to give, not to take, and so we don't have to be afraid. Instead, we can follow Jesus' advice. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. This will store up treasures for you in heaven, and the purses of heaven never get old or develop holes. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it, and no moth can destroy it. It is interesting here how Jesus ties his call to be generous to the poor to his view of the coming age. What Jesus is saying is this, that in light of eternity, giving is not a loss, it's a gain, it's an investment. As Randy Alcorn says it, we store up eternal treasure in the coming age by giving away temporary treasures in the present age. Think of when you invest your money into something, there's often a little feeling of pain as you might have loved to use that money to buy something else, but you don't lose that money. You're actually putting it in a place where it can grow in interest over time to fund the long-term dreams God has placed in your heart. In the same way, giving is investing in the kingdom of God. It's putting your money where it can grow over time, in the one place where it can actually last forever. In God's upside down kingdom, we actually get back what we give away, and what we try to keep, we end up losing. Jesus goes on to say these very famous words. He says, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. In other words, our heart follows our money. And when we spend our money on things that do not last, on temporal things, our hearts are destroyed by fear and greed. But Jesus has a solution. Give your money away to the poor, which is exactly what Jesus' first century disciples did. In Acts 2, the first story we have of the early church, we read this famous passage. It says, all the believers were together and they had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And then 2 chapters later, we read this. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything